highway stretched out before me like an endless black ribbon, its edges fading into the void beyond the reach of my headlights. It was the kind of road that made you feel like the world had shrunk down to just you, your car, and the oppressive weight of the night. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a steady, comforting rhythm that kept me grounded as the darkness pressed in from all sides. It was late, too late to be out here alone. But I had miles to go before I could rest, and the thought of an empty motel room wasn't exactly motivating me to stop. That's when I saw him, a figure, standing just off the shoulder, illuminated briefly in my high beams. A man holding a duffel bag, with a hood pulled low over his face. I don't know what made me slow down, what made me press my foot against the brake and ease the car toward the shoulder. It wasn't like me. I wasn't the kind of person to pick up hitchhikers. I'd heard all the horror stories, but something about him seemed normal, unassuming. As I pulled up beside him, the man didn't hesitate. He opened the passenger door and slid in, tossing his bag into the back seat. His movements were deliberate but calm, as though he had done this 100 times before. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not many folks do." "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual as I pulled back onto the highway. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road," he answered vaguely, turning to stare out the window. "I'll tell you when we get there." I nodded, though I wasn't sure he saw. We didn't speak after that. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. He didn't seem to want to talk, and that was fine with me. I wasn't in the mood for small talk either. As the minutes dragged on, I found myself sneaking glances at him out of the corner of my eye. He hadn't moved much since he got in, just sat there, staring out into the night, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. There was something about him that put me on edge, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the strangeness of picking up a stranger in the dead of night. An hour passed, the road winding through the trees, the occasional reflective sign flashing by in the distance. The hitchhiker hadn't said a word, and the silence between us was starting to feel oppressive. I tried to distract myself with the road ahead, but the tension gnawed at me. Then I glanced over at him again, and my heart stopped. His face, it was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The skin on his face was smooth, featureless, like stretched wax, with no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank expanse where a face should have been. Panic surged through me, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, struggling to process the impossible sight next to me. I blinked, hard, hoping that when I opened my eyes, I'd see something, anything, normal. But when I looked again, it was still there. A blank face staring forward, unmoving. I wanted to scream, to slam on the brakes, to throw open the door and run. But I couldn't. My body refused to move, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like it had taken root in my bones. I gripped the wheel, my foot pressing down on the gas, as if I could outrun whatever this was by driving faster. In the suffocating silence, my mind raced with questions I was too terrified to ask. What was he? How had I not noticed earlier? Was I dreaming? Hallucinating? I forced myself to glance at him again, just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. His head was still turned toward the window, as if he hadn't noticed my panic at all, hadn't noticed that I had seen whatever he was. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stop, couldn't confront him. All I could do was keep driving, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the wheel. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him shift in his seat. "Thank you for the ride," he said, his voice calm and distant. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but I forced myself to nod, my throat too dry to speak. My pulse hammered in my ears as I dared to glance over again. His face, it was back. The same face I had seen when he first climbed into the car. Eyes, nose, mouth, all there, perfectly normal. As if the last few minutes hadn't happened. As if the smooth, featureless face had been some kind of twisted illusion. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. He reached for the door handle, and before I could react, he was out of the car, stepping into the night. I watched him walk down the side of the road, disappearing into the darkness without another word. For a long moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my mind a whirl of confusion and terror. I could still feel the weight of his presence in the car, the The image of that blank face burned into my memory. It felt like the world had shifted, like I had crossed some invisible line into a place where reality no longer made sense. I looked back at the passenger seat, half expecting to see something left behind, something that would explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. No trace of him at all, as if he had never been there. I drove off, my mind struggling to make sense of it, but the further I went, the more I realized there would be no explanation, no reason. Only the cold, gnawing fear that clung to me, even as the miles rolled by and the night began to fade into the gray light of dawn. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was. Every shadow, every flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye made my heart race. I didn't sleep. I didn't talk about it. How could I? Who would believe me? But the worst part wasn't the fear, it was the doubt. Because sometimes when I catch my reflection in the mirror, I swear I see it, just for a second. A face, smooth and blank, staring back at me. I had been driving for hours, longer than I could remember. The winding country roads twisted and turned, each one looking more like the last, all blending into the oppressive darkness that had swallowed the sky. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter as I realized I had no idea where I was. My phone had lost signal miles ago, and the GPS was useless out here. The sense of isolation began to creep in, gnawing at the back of my mind. There were no houses, no signs, no lights, just the endless road and my growing unease. I had made a wrong turn somewhere, but I couldn't even remember when. I just wanted to find a gas station or a diner, anywhere with people, where I could ask for directions and get back on track. But there was nothing, just this endless stretch of nowhere. Then I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the headlights, some shadow thrown by the trees, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A young woman standing on the side of the road, drenched from head to toe, her long hair clinging to her face like dark strands of seaweed. She wore a dress, but it was soaked through, plastered to her body, and she stood motionless, her eyes fixed on something far away. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to leave her there and not look back. But my conscience wouldn't let me. It was late, and she looked like she needed help. Maybe she had broken down, or maybe she was lost too. I couldn't just leave her out here in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over, the gravel crunching under my tires, and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound calm even though my nerves were shot. The woman turned slowly, her movements sluggish, as if it took a great effort just to acknowledge me. She smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes, and without saying a word, she climbed into the passenger seat. The air in the car instantly grew colder, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. She didn't say thank you, didn't offer any explanation, just sat there, staring straight ahead, her wet clothes soaking into the upholstery. The smell hit me then, stagnant water, thick and suffocating, like the air around a murky pond. I tried to ignore it, rolling up the window and pulling back onto the road. For a long while, we drove in silence. The radio was off, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional drip of water falling from her onto the seat. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, hoping she would speak, explain herself, say something, but she never did. She just sat there, unmoving, her hair hanging like a veil over her face. I tried to break the silence. "So, where are you headed?" She didn't respond. Her eyes didn't even flicker in my direction. I felt a prickle of discomfort. Maybe she was in shock? I cleared my throat and tried again. "Are you okay? Do you need to go to a hospital or something?" Still nothing. Just that blank, unblinking stare straight ahead. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I forced myself to keep calm. Maybe she was just shaken up, or maybe she didn't want to talk. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the road, but the unease was creeping in, worming its way deeper into my thoughts. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I couldn't tell. The darkness outside felt suffocating, and I had no idea how far I'd gone or where I was going. My nerves were on edge, the silence between us growing more unbearable with each passing moment. Finally, unable to take it any longer, I asked again, "Where do you need to go?" This time she turned to me, her movements slow and deliberate. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the car. Back to the lake. My heart skipped a beat. The lake? I repeated, trying to sound casual. There aren't any lakes around here. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes wide and glassy, like she was seeing something far away, something I couldn't. A chill crawled up my spine, and I felt the temperature in the car drop even further. That's when the smell hit me again. Only this time, it wasn't just stagnant water. It was something worse. Rot. Decay. The smell of something long dead, hidden beneath the surface of the water. I gagged, my hand instinctively flying to my nose as I glanced at her again. Her skin was pale, so pale it almost seemed translucent, and her wet hair clung to her face in thick, matted strands. Her lips had twisted into a grotesque grin, and her eyes, those wide, dead eyes, bored into mine. "They never found me," she whispered, her voice a gurgling rasp, like it was bubbling up from beneath water. Panic surged through me, and I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a stop, and my heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. I turned to look at her, but the seat was empty. My breath caught in my throat. She was gone. I sat there, staring at the empty seat, my mind reeling. How could she be gone? I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car move. It was like she had simply vanished into thin air. But the smell was still there, clinging to the air inside the car, thick and overpowering. And the seat was soaked through, as if someone had been sitting there, dripping water the entire time. I scrambled out of the car, my legs shaking as I staggered to the side of the road. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. But there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of road and the suffocating silence of the night. I got back in the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel, and I sped off, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that spot as possible. For days after, the smell lingered, no matter how many times I cleaned the car. And sometimes late at night, when I'm driving alone on those same dark roads, I catch a glimpse of her in the rearview mirror, her long, wet hair clinging to her face, and her voice, a faint whisper, echoing in my ears. They never found me. And I know, deep down, she's still out there, waiting. It was late. Too late for me to be out on that empty road, far from home, with nothing but the hum of my truck's engine and the endless stretch of black ahead. I had been driving for hours, lost in my thoughts, trying to clear my head after another fight with Amy. But the road only seemed to bring me deeper into some unfamiliar darkness. The rain had started coming down hard about an hour ago, and my windshield wipers struggled to keep up. I squinted through the streaks of water, trying to make out the road ahead when I saw him. He stood on the shoulder, a lone figure, soaked through, arm outstretched in a half-hearted hitchhiker's gesture. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at me, making me feel like I owed someone a favor after all the bad decisions I'd made recently. Or maybe it was something else. I pulled the truck over and leaned across the passenger seat to roll the window down. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the rain hammering the roof of my truck. The old man stepped closer, his clothes drenched, hair plastered to his head. He didn't smile, didn't even seem to acknowledge the kindness. He just nodded, his eyes dark and distant, like they were focused on something miles away that I couldn't see. "Where are you headed?" I asked, as he climbed in, dripping water onto the worn upholstery. "Toward a town," he said, his voice gravelly and low. You wouldn't have heard of it. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, but something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. I shrugged. "As long as it's on my way, I don't mind." The old man said nothing, just stared out the window. I pulled back onto the road, and we drove in silence for a few miles. The sound of the rain softened, and for a while, I almost forgot he was there. But then he spoke again. "Strange lights in the sky," he muttered. More to himself than to me. "They've been following me for a long time now, always out of the corner of my eye, always just out of reach." I glanced at him. His eyes were wide, staring into the distance as if he could still see the lights he was talking about. I didn't say anything, just kept driving. People like him, drifters, often had their fair share of stories. This one seemed a bit out there, but who was I to judge? "And then there are the shadows," he continued, his voice a low rumble. "They don't leave you alone. Even when you think you're alone, they're there, watching. You ever notice that? How when you're all by yourself, you can feel eyes on you? I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. His words seemed to claw at something deep inside me, dredging up a fear I didn't want to acknowledge. I laughed awkwardly, trying to shake it off. "Can't say I've noticed," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. The old man turned to look at me for the first time, his eyes narrowing. "You will," he said softly. "We all do eventually." We drove in silence after that. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to his words. The lights in the sky, the shadows, the eyes that watched when no one was there. I tried to push it all away, tell myself it was just the ramblings of a crazy old man, but something about it stuck with me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. After what felt like an eternity, the old man leaned forward and pointed ahead. "Turn off here." I looked at where he was pointing, but there was nothing. Just an empty field on the side of the road stretching into the darkness. I slowed down, confused. "There's no road," I said, glancing over at him. "Here," he repeated, his voice firm. "This is where you drop me." I pulled over, the truck idling as I stared at the field. There was no town, no sign of life, just an expanse of wet, muddy earth. My fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel. Something didn't feel right. I turned to ask the old man if he was sure, but when I looked at the passenger seat, he was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the seat was empty. My breath caught in my throat. The door hadn't opened. The truck hadn't even rocked like someone got out. He was just gone. In his place, lying on the seat where he'd been moments before, was an old, yellowed newspaper. My hands shook as I reached for it, my pulse pounding in my ears. I unfolded the brittle paper, and my eyes landed on the headline, "Hitchhiker found dead on Route 42, body unidentified." The article was dated 40 years ago. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. The description of the hitchhiker matched him exactly. The same ragged clothes, the same gaunt face. My chest tightened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. This couldn't be real. I dropped a newspaper onto the seat and looked out the window again, searching the empty field for any sign of the old man. There was nothing. Only darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. I had to get out of there. I slammed the truck into gear and sped off, my eyes glued to the road ahead, heart racing in my chest. The rain came down harder, the wipers working furiously to keep up. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw him. The old man, sitting in the back seat, eyes wide and unblinking. My heart stopped and I jerked the wheel, almost careening off the road. When I looked again, he was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur. I don't remember how I made it home, how I parked the truck, or how I stumbled into my house. All I remember is the overwhelming dread that followed me, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I haven't driven down that road since, but sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows stretch long, I feel it, that sense of being watched. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something, just out of the corner of my eye. The lights in the sky, the shadows that never leave, and the eyes always watching, even when I'm alone. I know, now that the old man was right. We all notice, eventually.